March 17, 1964. 2:47 a.m. 12 NYPD officers surrounded a three-story brownstone at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, Harlem. This wasn't just any building. This was where Bumpy Johnson, the man the FBI called the most dangerous Negro criminal in New York, kept his primary residence, overlooking the Polo Grounds and Coogan's Bluff. What happened in the next 90 minutes would never appear in official police logs. Detective Frank Serpico, then a rookie patrolman assigned to the 32nd Precinct, would later tell his partner that something felt wrong that night. The raid wasn't authorized through normal channels. No judge had signed a warrant, and the commanding officer leading the operation, Lieutenant Vincent Corral, had personally ordered all patrol radios turned off at exactly 2:30 a.m. According to FBI surveillance files declassified in 1998, Bureau agents were conducting their own observation of Johnson's residence that same night. Special Agent Robert Lucy noted in his field report that he witnessed approximately 12 uniformed and plainclothes officers entering the premises without announcing themselves. But here's what made his blood run cold. Subject Johnson appeared to be expecting them. Inside that brownstone, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was playing chess with two men who would become central to what followed. The first was Joseph "Joe" Jelly Bonanno, nephew of crime boss Joseph Bonanno, who controlled significant heroin distribution through East Harlem. The second was Clarence "Cat" Williams, a former Golden Gloves boxer who served as Bumpy's head of security and had personally settled 14 disputes, all without pulling trigger. The doors burst open, but instead of chaos, there was silence. Lieutenant Corral walked directly to the chess table, bypassed the other men entirely, and placed a manila envelope in front of Bumpy. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't announce an arrest. According to Joe Jelly's testimony given years later to the New York State Organized Crime Task Force, Corral said only 7 words. This is from the commissioner. Personally, Bumpy Johnson, 60 years old, wearing a tailored Navy suit even at 3 a.m., opened the envelope without breaking eye contact. His hands, which FBI agent Lucy had described as unnaturally steady for a man of his reputation, didn't shake. He read the contents. Once, then again. Then he looked at Cat Williams and nodded toward the kitchen. Cat rose without a word and left the room. What was in that envelope? The official answer: nothing. No envelope. No raid. No record. The New York Times never reported it. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's primary black newspaper, published nothing. The NYPD's Internal Affairs Division has no file. Even the FBI surveillance log for that night contains a 12-minute gap from 2:47 to 2:59 a.m., marked only as equipment malfunction. But 7 people were in that room, and by April 1964, 3 of them would be dead under circumstances the medical examiner's office would classify as unusual. By May, 2 veteran NYPD officers would request immediate transfers out of Harlem, burning their pensions and seniority rather than stay another month. And by June, Commissioner Michael Murphy would quietly announce his early retirement, citing family health concerns. He was 49 years old and had publicly stated just 3 months earlier that he intended to serve until 1970. Something happened on March 17, 1964, in that Sugar Hill brownstone. Something that made the most powerful police official in New York walk away from his career. Something that made FBI agents erase their own surveillance tapes. Something that proved one terrifying truth. Bumpy Johnson didn't just control Harlem streets. He controlled the silence around them. And when the police crossed the invisible line that governed that silence, what came next wasn't revenge. It was something far more sophisticated. Something that would dismantle careers, redirect federal investigations, and reshape the entire power structure of New York law enforcement, all without a single shot being fired. This is the story they never officially reported, because officially it never happened. To understand why 12 police officers raided Bumpy Johnson's residence without paperwork, you need to understand the invisible government that ran Harlem in 1964. It wasn't the mayor. It wasn't the NYPD. And it certainly wasn't the elected officials representing the district. Harlem in the early 1960s was a powder keg wrapped in velvet. The neighborhood's population had swelled to over 230,000 residents, 94% of whom were Black Americans living in conditions the New York Herald Tribune called the worst housing density in the Western world. Families of 8 crowded into 2-room apartments. Tuberculosis rates were triple the city average, and unemployment among Black men under 30 had reached 42%. Into that pressure cooker walked men like Bumpy Johnson. But Johnson wasn't like the flashy gangsters who preceded him. While Lucky Luciano wore silk suits and Dutch Schultz built beer empires, Bumpy built something more valuable: legitimacy. He owned a funeral home. He funded church programs. He paid rent for families facing eviction. The Amsterdam News once ran an editorial, quickly retracted, calling him Harlem's unofficial mayor. FBI Special Agent Thomas Ryan, who tracked Johnson for 11 years, wrote in his 1963 annual report, "Subject operates with unusual political sophistication, maintains relationships with 3 city council members, 2 state assembly representatives, and an estimated 40 to 60 NYPD officers across Manhattan North. Unlike traditional organized crime figures, Subject's power derives not from fear alone, but from genuine community support." That support was strategic. When the 1964 Harlem riots were still 3 months away, Bumpy Johnson already knew they were coming. He knew because he paid attention to what the police ignored: the rage building in every apartment where Black teenagers were graduating high school and unemployment, where mothers were watching their sons get stopped and frisked 9 times a week, where storefront churches preach patience while Malcolm X, just 30 blocks north, preached something else entirely. Johnson's inner circle in early 1964 consisted of 5 key individuals, each controlling a different piece of Harlem's infrastructure. Cat Williams ran security. Former boxer, Korean War veteran, fluent in 3 languages. He never carried a gun because he didn't need one. His reputation was enough. In 1962, when 2 enforcers from the Genovese family attempted to collect protection payments from businesses on 125th Street, Cat didn't fight them. He simply walked them to the Teresa Hotel and introduced them to 14 shop owners who politely explained they were already protected. The Genovese enforcers left Harlem and never returned. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, controlled the numbers racket, an underground lottery that generated an estimated $50 million annually across Harlem. Now in her 60s, St. Clair had been Bumpy's mentor in the 1930s. She taught him that power without community investment was just temporary violence. She also maintained direct connections to Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that still controlled patronage jobs across the city. Lewis read, Mitchell handled political relationships. A former City College professor who'd been blacklisted during McCarthy-era investigations, Mitchell understood power better than anyone. He knew which judges owed favors, which cops needed tuition money for their kids, which politicians had mistresses they wanted kept quiet. Mitchell didn't threaten. He simply knew things. And in 1964 New York, information was currency. Junie Bird, Johnson's nephew, managed the day-to-day street operations. Only 28, but already respected, Junie understood the younger generation in ways Bumpy couldn't. He saw how CORE and SNCC were changing the conversation around civil rights. He knew that the old model of backroom deals with white power structures was dying, and he quietly worried that his uncle's empire was built on compromises that wouldn't survive the next decade. And then there was Sonny Chance, Bumpy's driver and bodyguard, a Vietnam veteran who'd returned from Da Nang in 1963 with Bronze Star and psychological scars he never discussed. Sonny didn't talk much, but according to FBI surveillance transcripts, he was the only person in Bumpy's circle who could tell him no and have Johnson actually listen. On the law enforcement side, the architecture was equally complex. Lieutenant Vincent Corral commanded the 32nd Precinct's Vice Squad. Officially, he'd made 143 arrests in 1963. Unofficially, Red Mitchell paid him $800 monthly to ensure those arrests never touched anyone important. Corral wasn't corrupt by Harlem standards. He was simply practical. His pension was 12 years away, his daughter needed college tuition, and policing Harlem meant choosing which crimes to care about. Detective Raymond Ray Gilroy was different. A 15-year veteran who'd actually grown up in Harlem, Gilroy believed in something increasingly rare: community policing before it had a name. He knew Bumpy Johnson personally, had even accepted donations from him for the local PAL Center. But Gilroy also knew that federal pressure was mounting, that the FBI wanted high-profile arrests, and that eventually everyone protecting Johnson would have to choose sides. And then there was Commissioner Michael Murphy. Murphy had taken command of the NYPD in 1961 with a mandate from Mayor Robert Wagner to clean up organized crime. But Murphy understood that organized crime meant different things in different neighborhoods. In Little Italy, it meant mafia families controlling unions. In Hell's Kitchen, it meant Irish gangs running protection rackets. In Harlem, it meant Bumpy Johnson's carefully constructed mutual aid society that operated in the gray space between community service and criminal enterprise. Murphy had actually met Johnson once, in 1962, during secret negotiations after a series of police shootings threatened to ignite riots. The meeting happened at Sylvia's restaurant on Lenox Avenue, neutral ground. No lawyers, no press, no official record. According to Red Mitchell, who arranged the meeting, Murphy had asked Johnson a simple question: "What do you want?" Johnson's answer shaped everything that followed. "I want what the Italians have: respect, protection, and the pretense of legitimacy." For 18 months, there was an understanding. Police didn't raid the numbers operations. Federal prosecutors focused their attention on narcotics trafficking in the Bronx. And when violence erupted, which it inevitably did, Johnson's people handled it quietly, internally, before it became press-worthy. But in early March 1964, something changed. The FBI promoted a new special agent in charge for the New York field office, Arthur Nolan, a former prosecutor who'd built his reputation dismantling corruption in Chicago. Nolan didn't believe in accommodations. He didn't care about community stability or pragmatic policing. He believed in federal warrants, wiretaps, and high-profile arrests. And he convinced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that Bumpy Johnson was the key to dismantling black organized crime across the entire Northeast Corridor. On March 12, 1964, Nolan called Commissioner Murphy and delivered an ultimatum: arrest Johnson within 30 days, or the FBI would do it themselves, and in the process expose every police officer who'd taken payments, every judge who'd dismissed cases, and every politician who'd looked the other way. Murphy had 1 week to decide. He chose confrontation. And on March 17th, at 2:47 a.m., he sent Lieutenant Corral to deliver that message personally, in a manila envelope that contained not an arrest warrant, but something far more dangerous: a choice. The chess pieces were still arranged on the board when Cat Williams returned from the kitchen. He wasn't alone. According to Joe Jelly's sealed testimony, Cat had made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, each under 90 seconds, each to a different person. The first went to Judge Harold Stevens at his residence in Riverdale. The second to Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr.'s private line. The third to someone Joe Jelly wouldn't identify even under oath, referring to them only as the banker. While Cat was in the kitchen, something extraordinary happened in the living room. Lieutenant Corral, surrounded by 11 officers with guns drawn, sat down at the chess table. Detective Frank Serpico, positioned near the doorway, would later tell investigative journalist David Burnham that he'd never seen anything like it. Corral sat across from Johnson like they were in a private club. The other officers just stood there, waiting, like this happened every night. Bumpy Johnson, still holding the letter from Commissioner Murphy's envelope, asked Corral a single question: "Did you read this before delivering it?" Corral shook his head. "Then you don't know what you've started," Johnson said quietly. The letter itself has never been recovered, but multiple sources have pieced together its contents. Commissioner Murphy was offering Johnson an ultimatum disguised as an opportunity: become a confidential informant against Italian mafia families operating in Harlem, particularly the Genovese and Banana organizations, or face federal racketeering charges that would guarantee 20 years in prison. The FBI had compiled a 247-page case file. They had wiretap recordings, They had witness statements from 12 individuals willing to testify. And most devastatingly, they had financial records showing unexplained income totaling $3.4 million between 1960 and 1963. Murphy's letter was clear. Cooperation meant immunity. Refusal meant destruction. But Murphy had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed Bumpy Johnson's power came from secrecy, that exposing his operations would dismantle his empire. What Murphy didn't understand was that Johnson's actual power came from something far more sophisticated, mutually assured destruction. When Cat Williams returned to the living room, he handed Bumpy a single piece of paper. Bumpy read it, smiled for the first time that night, and slid it across the chess table to Lieutenant Corral. "You should call your wife," Johnson said. "Tell her you'll be home soon, and that she shouldn't believe anything she reads in the newspapers tomorrow." Corral's face went pale. The paper contained a list. 7 names, all NYPD officers. Ranks from sergeant to captain, each with a number beside their name. Dollar amounts ranging from $400 to $2,800. Monthly payments for 18 months, all documented. But the truly devastating detail was at the bottom of the page. 3 deposit slip photocopies showing those exact amounts being deposited into accounts at Manufacturers Trust Company, Bronx Savings Bank, and Chase Manhattan, all on the same day each month. Red Mitchell had kept records. Perfect, notarized, legally admissible records. Corral stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. "This is," he started. "Insurance," Bumpy finished. "And before you consider destroying it, you should know there are 6 other copies. One with my attorney, one in a safety deposit box in Philadelphia, and one with someone you really don't want to upset. That last copy, according to Joe Jelly's testimony, was with Judge Harold Stevens, the same judge who dismissed 4 cases against Johnson's associates in the past 2 years. Stevens wasn't corrupt. He was compromised. Mitchell had evidence that Stevens' son had been arrested in 1961 for heroin possession in Washington Square Park, an arrest that mysteriously disappeared from all official records after Stevens began ruling favorably on Harlem-related cases. But Johnson wasn't done. "The commissioner thinks this is about narcotics and numbers," Johnson said, standing now, buttoning his suit jacket with the same calm precision he brought to everything. "He thinks I'm the problem that needs solving. But let me explain what actually happens if I go to prison." He walked to the window overlooking Edgecombe Avenue. 4 stories down, even at 3 a.m., people were on the street. Young men in groups of 3 and 4. Old women coming home from night shifts. Children who should have been sleeping but weren't because their apartments were too hot, too crowded, too hopeless. "Right now, there's order," Johnson continued. "People know the rules. They know where to go if they can't make rent. They know which corners to avoid. They know that if someone's son gets arrested, there's someone they can call who might be able to help. That's not crime, Lieutenant. That's government." Sonny Chance, who'd been silent until now, spoke up from his position near the door. 3 months ago, those kids from SNCC came up from Mississippi. Started talking about police brutality, about fighting back. My uncle convinced them to organize voter registration instead. You know how many people registered in the past 12 weeks? 2,341. You know how many riots we've had? 0. This was the threat Murphy hadn't anticipated. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just offering mutually assured destruction through corruption exposure. He was threatening chaos. Real chaos. The kind that would make the Watts riots look like a street corner argument. And everyone in that room knew that Harlem in 1964 was one spark away from burning. Detective Raymond Gilroy, who'd been standing near the staircase, finally spoke. "So what do you want?" Johnson turned from a window. "I want the same thing I've always wanted. To be left alone to do what I do. The commissioner can tell the FBI he raided my home, found nothing, and determined I'm not worth federal resources. The FBI can save face by announcing they're focusing on narcotics importation at the docks instead. And everyone goes home alive, employed, and with their reputations intact. And if the commissioner refuses?" Gilroy asked. Johnson looked directly at Lieutenant Corral. "Then tomorrow morning, the New York Times receives documentation of systematic police corruption spanning 3 precincts. The Amsterdam News receives testimony from 47 community members detailing illegal searches, planted evidence, and brutality complaints that were never investigated. And by tomorrow afternoon, you'll have riots that make Birmingham look peaceful. The room was silent for 43 seconds. Sir Pico would later tell David Burnham that he counted every one of them. Finally, Corral picked up the landline phone on Johnson's side table and dialed a number from memory. Commissioner Murphy answered on the second ring. "Sir," Corral said, "we have a situation." Commissioner Michael Murphy had been awake since 11 p.m., waiting. His office at One Police Plaza was dark except for a single desk lamp illuminating maps of Harlem spread across his mahogany desk. Red circles marked every location where Bumpy Johnson's organization operated: social clubs, funeral homes, barbershops, restaurants. Blue circles indicated NYPD surveillance positions. Yellow markers showed where FBI agents had established listening posts. The map looked like a military operation, because that's what Murphy believed it was: a war against organized crime. When his secure line rang at 3:18 a.m., Murphy knew immediately that the raid hadn't gone as planned. "Report," Murphy said, skipping any greeting. Lieutenant Corral's voice was tight. "Sir, we need to discuss extraction protocols." That phrase, extraction protocols, was NYPD code for operations that had gone catastrophically wrong. Murphy felt his chest tighten. "Are officers in danger?" Murphy demanded. "No, sir. But the operation has complications. Subject is requesting direct communication with you." Immediately, Murphy's hand went to the glass of scotch he'd poured an hour earlier but hadn't touched. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how arrests worked. Criminal suspects didn't negotiate with police commissioners. "Put him on," Murphy said finally. There was a moment of shuffling. Then Bumpy Johnson's voice, calm, educated, without any trace of the street vernacular Murphy had heard on FBI wiretaps, came through the line. "Commissioner Murphy, thank you for taking my call at this ungodly hour. I apologize for the disruption to your evening." The politeness was unsettling. Murphy had expected threats, anger, the typical criminal bluster. Instead, Johnson sounded like a corporate lawyer. "Mr. Johnson, you're under investigation by federal." "I'm aware," Johnson interrupted smoothly. "FBI Special Agent Arthur Nolan, former prosecutor from Chicago, known for aggressive RICO tactics. He's currently building cases against 17 individuals in New York, of which I'm apparently the centerpiece." "I've read his file." Murphy went cold. That information was classified. How did Johnson know about Nolan's broader investigation? "You seem well-informed," Murphy said carefully. "I make it my business to understand threats, Commissioner, just as you make it your business to understand threats to this city. Which is why I know you're facing an impossible situation. The FBI wants high-profile arrests to justify their organized crime budget. The mayor wants Harlem quiet during an election year. And you're caught between federal pressure and political reality." Murphy said nothing. Johnson was right on every count. "So let me propose something unusual," Johnson continued. "Instead of proceeding with this arrest, which will accomplish nothing except accelerating the chaos we both know is coming, I'd like to offer you something more valuable than my conviction. I don't negotiate with." "Peace," Johnson said. The single word cut through Murphy's objection. "For the next 6 months, no riots, no headlines, no embarrassments for the NYPD. You give the FBI a plausible reason why I'm not worth pursuing right now, and I guarantee you that Harlem stays calm through November." Murphy almost laughed. "You're offering to control civil unrest? That's not how, isn't it?" Johnson's voice sharpened. "Tell me, Commissioner, what happened after the police shot James Powell in July '63? Murphy remembered. A 15-year-old black student shot by an off-duty officer. Protests erupted within hours. The city teetered on the edge of riots for 3 days. "We contained it," Murphy said. "No," Johnson corrected. "I contained it. My people went into those crowds. We talked to the organizers. We arranged meetings with community leaders. We channeled that rage into voter registration drives and peaceful marches. The NYPD didn't stop those riots, Commissioner. I did, and no one ever thanked me for it." Through the phone line, Murphy could hear other voices in Johnson's apartment. Detective Gilroy was speaking to someone. Lieutenant Corral was on another line. "If what you're saying is true," Murphy said slowly, "why would you help the police? Why would you prevent riots?" Johnson's answer was immediate. "Because riots don't serve my interests. Dead teenagers don't generate revenue. Burned buildings don't create stability. And federal troops occupying Harlem would dismantle everything I've built. You think I'm some street thug who thrives on chaos, Commissioner, but I'm a businessman, and chaos is bad for business." Murphy walked to his office window. Manhattan stretched out below him, millions of people sleeping, unaware that the fate of the city's largest black neighborhood was being negotiated over a telephone at 3:30 in the morning. "What specifically are you proposing?" Murphy asked. "Simple. You tell the FBI that your raid tonight uncovered evidence suggesting my organization has been overestimated, that I'm primarily involved in numbers running and small-scale bookmaking, not narcotics importation or violent crime. You recommend they redirect resources toward the Genovese family's heroin operations, which are actually expanding, unlike mine. The FBI isn't going to just accept." "Yes, they will," Johnson interrupted, "because I'm going to give them something bigger. There's a heroin shipment coming through Red Hook, Brooklyn, in 11 days. Approximately 47 kilograms, street value around $3.2 million. It's being coordinated by Vincent Gigani's crew. I'll provide dates, locations, and the names of 4 corrupt customs officials facilitating the import." Murphy's mind raced. Vincent the Chin Gigani was a high-priority target. A seizure of that magnitude would be the biggest drug bust in New York history. The FBI would celebrate it as a major victory. "How do you have this information?" Murphy demanded. "Because the Genovese family tried to partner with me last year, and I refused. They've been attempting to expand into Harlem ever since. This shipment is part of that expansion. I'd rather the FBI intercept it than have Italian mobsters flooding my neighborhood with heroin that kills teenagers." There was a logic to it that Murphy couldn't deny. If Johnson was telling the truth, the FBI would get a massive bust. The NYPD would avoid the political nightmare of arresting Harlem's most connected figure right before an election, and the city would avoid potential riots. But there was a cost. "If I do this," Murphy said, "I'm essentially acknowledging that you have influence over law enforcement priorities." "No," Johnson corrected. "You're acknowledging reality. I already have that influence, Commissioner. This conversation is just making it official." Murphy looked at the maps on his desk. All those red circles representing Johnson's operations. All those blue surveillance positions. All those federal resources allocated to bringing down one man. And for what? To trigger riots? To create a power vacuum that would be filled by someone worse? To hand the FBI a symbolic victory while heroin continued flooding into the city through actually violent organizations? "I need guarantees," Murphy said finally. "Name them. If there are any major crimes, murders, gang violence, anything that generates press attention in Harlem over the next 6 months, this deal is void. I'll bring every resource the NYPD has against your organization." "Agreed," Johnson said immediately. "Second, the information about the Red Hook shipment needs to be actionable. If it's false, if the FBI raids an empty warehouse, you and I will have a very different conversation. The information is accurate. I'll have detailed documentation delivered to FBI headquarters within 48 hours. Anonymous tip, untraceable. Third," Murphy continued, "you stay visible. No disappearing to Philadelphia or Chicago. You remain in New York where we can monitor you." Johnson actually laughed at that. "Commissioner, I'm 60 years old. Where exactly do you think I'm going to run? Harlem is my home. It's always been my home." Murphy heard truth in that statement. Johnson wasn't some transient criminal. He was embedded in the community in ways that made him both more dangerous and more predictable than traditional organized crime figures. "I need 24 hours to consider this," Murphy said. "You have 12, Johnson countered. "At 3:30 p.m. tomorrow. Today, technically, the New York Times will receive documentation of police corruption unless I personally intervene. Consider that my deadline." "That's extortion. That's negotiation, Commissioner. The difference is subtlety. Murphy realized he'd already made his decision. The moment he'd taken Johnson's phone call, he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I want Lieutenant Corral and his team out of your residence immediately, Murphy said. This raid never happened. No reports, no paperwork, no witnesses. Already done, Johnson said. Your officers are welcome to leave whenever they'd like. Coffee's fresh if they'd like some before going. The casual hospitality was more intimidating than any threat. Murphy hung up without saying goodbye. For 3 minutes, he sat in his dark office, understanding that he'd just fundamentally altered his relationship with law enforcement, with federal oversight, and with his own conscience. Then he called FBI Special Agent Arthur Nolan's emergency line. Arthur, it's Murphy. We need to talk about redirecting resources. I have intelligence on a major heroin operation in Brooklyn that requires immediate attention. The raid that never officially happened ended at 4:12 a.m. 12 NYPD officers filed out of 409 Edgecombe Avenue without arrests, without evidence bags, without anything except the understanding that they'd witnessed something unprecedented. Lieutenant Corral gathered his team on the corner of 155th Street and Edgecombe, under a streetlight that had been broken for 3 months, but suddenly seemed very bright. What happened in there, Corral said quietly, doesn't get discussed. Not in reports. Not with your wives. Not even with each other. Understood? Every officer nodded except Frank Serpico. Sir, Serpico said, we just had a police commissioner negotiate with. Drop it, Serpico, Detective Gilroy interrupted. You're 24 years old. You've been on the force 9 months. Trust me when I say that some things in this city work in ways the academy doesn't teach. Serpico wanted to argue. Years later, he would argue, all the way to the Knapp Commission hearings that would expose systematic police corruption across New York. But on March 17, 1964, he was still young enough to believe that maybe this was an isolated incident, a one-time compromise, something that wouldn't define his career. He was wrong. By 6 a.m., Commissioner Murphy had drafted a confidential memo to FBI Special Agent Arthur Nolan. The memo, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 1994, recommended redirecting federal investigative resources toward heroin importation networks believed to be operating through Brooklyn maritime facilities. The memo made no mention of Bumpy Johnson except to note that preliminary investigation suggests subjects' involvement in narcotics trafficking may have been overstated by confidential informants. By 8 a.m., Bumpy Johnson was eating breakfast at Wells Supper Club on 7th Avenue, his regular spot, his regular table, acting like the previous 6 hours hadn't happened. The owner, Clara Wells, served him personally 2 eggs over easy, grits, bacon, coffee black. Same order he'd had every Tuesday for 12 years. But something had changed. According to waitress Dorothy Hamilton, who later gave oral history testimony to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, every police officer who walked past Wells that morning nodded respectfully toward Johnson's table. Not the usual hostile surveillance. Not the aggressive positioning. Respect. It was like watching someone become mayor overnight, Hamilton recalled. Suddenly, every cop in Harlem understood that Mr. Johnson wasn't just someone they couldn't arrest. He was someone they couldn't afford to disrespect. The real proof came at 2 p.m. when Detective Gilroy personally delivered an envelope to Johnson at his table. Inside was a single document, the original letter from Commissioner Murphy that had started everything. The letter that should have remained in evidence. The letter that implicated Murphy in attempting to force a civilian into becoming a confidential informant without proper legal authorization. Gilroy didn't stay, didn't explain, just placed the envelope on the table next to Johnson's coffee cup and walked out. Red Mitchell, sitting across from Johnson, examined the letter and whistled low. They're giving you insurance on their own insurance. Johnson folded the letter and put it in his inside jacket pocket. No, they're acknowledging reality. The question is whether they understand what that reality means. What it meant became clear over the next 11 days. On March 28, 1964, FBI agents raided a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. They seized 47.3 kilograms of heroin, arrested 9 individuals, including 2 U.S. Customs officials, and held a press conference celebrating it as the largest heroin seizure in New York history. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally sent commendations to the New York field office. The confidential tip that had led to the raid came from an anonymous source. The FBI never investigated who that source might be. They didn't want to know. But the consequences rippled out in ways even Johnson hadn't anticipated. Vincent the Chin Gigante, furious at the loss of his heroin shipment, immediately suspected someone had informed. His paranoia led him to eliminate 3 of his own associates suspected of being informants. The Genovese family's Harlem expansion plans collapsed within 6 weeks. By May 1964, Italian mob presence in Harlem had diminished to the lowest level in 20 years. Bumpy Johnson had used the FBI to eliminate his competition. On April 3rd, Detective Frank Serpico requested a transfer to Manhattan South. His transfer was denied. Instead, he was promoted to Detective 3rd grade and assigned to the 32nd Precinct Vice Squad, the same squad that had raided Johnson's apartment. Lieutenant Corral personally selected him. "You're smart, Serpico," Corral told him during a private meeting. "Too smart. So let me give you advice that might save your career. In Harlem, there's the law we write down and the law that keeps people alive. Learn the difference." Serpico never forgot that conversation. 5 years later, it would fuel his decision to expose corruption throughout the NYPD. But in April 1964, he was still trying to understand how a criminal could negotiate with a police commissioner and win. On April 15th, the New York Times published a front-page story about federal efforts to combat heroin trafficking. The article prominently featured Commissioner Murphy praising FBI Director Hoover's leadership. There was no mention of Bumpy Johnson, no mention of Harlem, no mention of negotiations. The silence was the message. But the strangest consequence emerged on April 22nd. Judge Harold Stevens, the judge whose son's arrest had mysteriously disappeared, announced his retirement from a bench. His decision shocked the legal community. Stevens was only 51 years old, considered a rising star in the New York judiciary, mentioned frequently as a potential state Supreme Court appointee. His retirement letter mentioned personal health concerns and desire to spend more time with family. The truth, according to Red Mitchell's private notes, later discovered in his estate after his death in 1989, was simpler. Stevens couldn't live with the compromise anymore. The arrest he'd helped bury, the cases he dismissed, the debt he owed to people he despised. Johnson had freed him. By accepting the envelope that night, by negotiating directly with Commissioner Murphy, Johnson had shifted the power dynamic so fundamentally that Stevens no longer needed to be compromised. The NYPD wasn't pursuing Johnson. The FBI had redirected their focus. The judges Johnson had helped were no longer useful to him. Stevens walked away with his reputation intact, his son's record clean, and his conscience, if not clear, at least freed from ongoing debt. It was the most sophisticated form of power Johnson possessed, the ability to release people from obligations at precisely the moment that release created maximum loyalty. If you enjoyed this deep dive into real history they tried to erase, subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation into the secret powers that shaped New York streets. By May 1st, Commissioner Murphy had survived 3 separate internal affairs inquiries related to the Red Hook heroin bust. All 3 inquiries concluded that Murphy's intelligence and strategic redirection had been exemplary law enforcement leadership. Nobody asked where the intelligence came from. On May 7th, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. gave a sermon at Abyssinian Baptist Church celebrating new era of cooperation between law enforcement and the Harlem community. Powell praised Commissioner Murphy by name. He praised the FBI's focus on narcotics importation. He praised community leaders who worked behind the scenes to ensure stability. Bumpy Johnson sat in the 3rd row, same seat he'd occupied every other Sunday for 15 years. After the service, Powell and Johnson shook hands on the church steps. The New York-Amsterdam News photographer captured the image. It ran on page 3 under the headline Community Unity. The federal prosecutor who'd been building the racketeering case against Johnson received the photo in the mail. No note, no explanation, just the image of a congressman shaking hands with a suspected criminal on church steps, surrounded by 200 witnesses, including 2 NYPD officers providing security. The prosecutor closed the case file 2 days later. June 1964 arrived with unseasonable heat. Temperatures reached 93 degrees by noon on June 4th. Harlem apartment buildings without air conditioning became furnaces. Fire hydrants on every corner sprayed water into the streets. Teenagers gathered on stoops. Old men played dominoes in the shade of awnings. And everyone waited for something to break. But the riots everyone expected never came. Instead, something stranger happened. On June 8th, police officer Thomas Brennan was found dead in his apartment in Queens. Brennan had been one of the 12 officers present during the March 17th raid on Johnson's residence. He was 34 years old. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide, single gunshot wound to the head, his service weapon, no signs of struggle. The ruling would have been unremarkable except for one detail. Brennan was left-handed. The gunshot wound was on the right side of his head. His service weapon was found in his right hand. When Detective Gilroy raised questions about the inconsistency during the investigation, Internal Affairs told him to let it rest. The case was closed within 72 hours. Brennan's widow received a full pension and an official commendation for her husband's distinguished service. She moved to New Jersey 6 weeks later and never spoke publicly about her husband's death. On June 19th, Detective Luis Ramirez, another officer present at the raid, died in what was officially classified as a traffic accident. Ramirez's car struck a concrete barrier on the FDR Drive at 2 a.m. He was the only person in the vehicle. Witnesses reported seeing his car accelerate directly toward the barrier without attempting to brake. Ramirez had been scheduled to testify the following week in an unrelated police brutality case involving officers from the 32nd Precinct. His testimony was expected to corroborate complaints from 3 Harlem residents about illegal searches and planted evidence. After Ramirez's death, the case collapsed. No other officers would testify. The charges were dismissed. Frank Serpico attended Ramirez's funeral. He stood in the back of St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx and watched 200 police officers pay their respects. After the service, he approached Lieutenant Corral. "Sir, I need to ask you something," Serpico said quietly. "Off the record." Corral's face was unreadable. "Go ahead." Brennan and Ramirez. Both at the raid. Both dead within 2 weeks. That's not coincidence. Corral studied Serpico for a long moment. "You're asking me if someone killed him?" "I'm asking if we're in danger." "All of us who were there." Corral lit a cigarette, took a long drag. "You know what's interesting about danger, Serpico? Sometimes the most dangerous thing is talking about danger." Brennan started drinking heavy in April. Told his wife he couldn't sleep. Kept saying he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Ramirez wasn't much better. Started carrying his gun off duty. Jumped at shadows. They were scared, and fear makes people unpredictable. So they killed themselves? I didn't say that. I said they were scared. What happened after that? Corral shrugged. The medical examiner makes those determinations, not me. Serpico felt ice in his stomach. What should I be worried about, sir? Corral dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. Don't be scared. Don't talk about what you saw. Don't try to be a hero. Go home to your family every night and remember that sometimes the only way to survive is to forget. On June 23rd, Sergeant Kevin O'Malley and Officer Dennis Murphy, the 11th and 12th officers present at the raid, submitted transfer requests to precincts outside Manhattan. O'Malley requested assignment to Staten Island. Murphy asked for the Bronx. Both transfers were approved within 24 hours. Unprecedented speed for NYPD bureaucracy. Both officers left the 32nd precinct without farewell parties, without public statements, burning seniority and career advancement opportunities for the privilege of leaving Harlem. Years later, during the Knapp Commission hearings, O'Malley would be asked about corruption in Harlem precincts. His answer would be terse. I worked there for 8 months. I saw things I can't talk about. I left for my family's sake. He refused to elaborate. By June 30th, of the 12 officers who'd entered Bumpy Johnson's apartment on March 17th, 2 were dead. 2 had transferred out. 8 remained, including Serpico, Gilroy, and Corral. None had spoken publicly about what happened that night. And then Commissioner Michael Murphy made his announcement. On July 2nd, Murphy called a press conference at one police plaza. Standing before 24 reporters, looking 20 years older than his 49 years, Murphy read from a prepared statement. After 31 years of service to the city of New York, I am announcing my retirement as police commissioner effective August 1st. This decision comes after careful consideration of both my family's needs and my own health. I'm proud of the progress we've made in combating organized crime and look forward to spending more time with my wife and children. The reporters erupted with questions. Murphy answered none of them. He left the podium after 90 seconds and never gave another public interview. The official explanation, family health concerns, was accepted by the press. The New York Times ran a respectful profile celebrating Murphy's career. Mayor Robert Wagner praised his dedicated service. The transition to a new commissioner proceeded smoothly. But inside NYPD headquarters, everyone understood the truth. Murphy hadn't retired. He'd escaped. According to notes from Deputy Commissioner Thomas Reagan, obtained decades later through FOIA requests, Murphy had received 3 separate threats in the weeks following the March 17th raid. The first came in the form of a phone call to his home at 3 a.m. on April 11th. A male voice, never identified, told Murphy's wife, "Tell your husband that keeping promises ensures long life. Breaking them doesn't." The second arrived as a manila envelope left at one police plaza reception on May 18th. Inside were photographs of Murphy's daughter entering her school, his son playing baseball, his wife shopping in their Westchester neighborhood. No note, just photos proving that someone knew their routines. The third was delivered personally. On June 15th, Red Mitchell walked into Murphy's office, bypassing security, bypassing the receptionist, bypassing every protocol, and placed a handwritten letter on Murphy's desk. The letter, according to Reagan's notes, contained a simple message. "Commissioner Murphy, you've honored our agreement admirably. The Red Hook raid was successful. Harlem has remained peaceful. Federal pressure has diminished. You've proven yourself a man of your word. Now it's time to protect that reputation by stepping away before circumstances force a different conclusion. Retire well. Live quietly. Remember that some victories are measured in what doesn't happen, not what does." A grateful citizen, Murphy announced his retirement 2 weeks later. Frank Serpico, learning about the retirement, confronted Detective Gilroy. They forced him out. Johnson and whoever he's working with, they forced out the police commissioner of New York City. Gilroy, smoking a cigarette on the precinct steps, didn't disagree. "Kid, let me tell you something about power. Real power isn't making people do what you want. It's making them choose to do what you want because the alternatives are worse." Murphy wasn't forced out. He made a rational choice. And if you're smart, you'll learn the difference. Between what? Between fighting and surviving. But the most disturbing revelation came on July 7th, when a medical examiner's office quietly amended Thomas Brennan's cause of death. The original ruling, suicide. The amended ruling, undetermined circumstances. The change was buried in administrative paperwork. No press release, no explanation, just a bureaucratic acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the official story wasn't entirely accurate. Detective Gilroy obtained a copy of the amended report. He showed it to Serpico during a late-night shift. "Why change it now?" Serpico asked. "Because someone wants us to know Gilroy said, "Someone wants us to understand that truth is flexible, that official records can be altered, that nothing is permanent except the understanding that we keep our mouths shut." Ooh, Gilroy shrugged. Does it matter? Could be Johnson's people making sure we remember. Could be our own people covering tracks. Could be the FBI protecting its Red Hook victory. When everyone has something to hide, kid, nobody wants the light turned on. By July 15th, the pattern was undeniable. 3 people connected to the March 17th raid were dead: Brennan, Ramirez, and Judge Harold Stevens, who died of a heart attack on July 3rd, officially natural causes, though he'd shown no prior heart problems. 2 officers had fled to other boroughs. 1 commissioner had retired, and Harlem remained quiet. No riots, no major crimes, no federal investigations. Whatever Bumpy Johnson had promised Commissioner Murphy, he delivered. The cost was measured in silence, in altered records, in deaths that raised questions nobody wanted answered, and in one young detective named Frank Serpico slowly realizing that the NYPD he'd joined wasn't the institution he'd imagined. The summer of 1964 became the summer that never exploded. While Los Angeles would burn during the Watts riots in 1965, while Newark and Detroit would erupt in 1967, Harlem remained strangely, almost supernaturally calm through the most volatile period of urban unrest in American history. Historians would later credit community organizing, police reform efforts, and Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr.'s political leadership. All of those factors contributed. But the people who lived in Harlem during that period understood a different truth. The calm had been negotiated. Bumpy Johnson maintained his end of the bargain with ruthless precision. When young activists from SNCC and CORE arrived in Harlem planning confrontational protests, Johnson's people met with them privately. According to declassified FBI memos from 1965, Bureau agents noted unusual cooperation between traditional criminal elements and civil rights organizers that resulted in strategically managed demonstrations that remained peaceful. The FBI never understood what they were witnessing. Johnson redirecting rage into organization, channeling justified anger into voter registration drives, transforming potential riots into political power. By November 1964, Harlem had registered 6,847 new voters, a 34% increase that would fundamentally reshape local politics for the next decade. But the cost of that peace remained hidden. Frank Serpico never forgot what he witnessed on March 17, 1964. Over the next 7 years, as he rose through the ranks and encountered increasingly systemic corruption, that night became his reference point. If a police commissioner could negotiate with organized crime to prevent riots, what else was negotiable? What other compromises had been made? What other truths had been buried? In 1971, Serpico testified before the Knapp Commission, exposing corruption throughout the NYPD. His testimony revolutionized police accountability in New York. But when asked specifically about incidents in Harlem during the early 1960s, Serpico became uncharacteristically vague. "There are things that happened that I didn't understand at the time," he testified. "Things that made me question whether law enforcement was about justice or about management, about what we were actually protecting and who we were actually serving." He never mentioned Bumpy Johnson by name, never described the March 17th raid, never detailed Commissioner Murphy's negotiations. Some silences, even Serpico understood, protected more than they concealed. Lieutenant Vincent Corral retired in 1968 with full pension and commendations. He moved to Florida and died in 1989. His police records, requested through FOIA in 2003, showed significant redactions for the period between March and August 1964. The redactions were classified as ongoing investigation, despite no active investigation existing. Detective Raymond Gilroy remained in Harlem until his retirement in 1979. He became known as one of the precinct's most effective community liaisons, respected by residents and criminals alike. After retiring, he occasionally gave talks at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice about practical policing in complex communities. In 1987, a graduate student asked him directly, "Did you ever encounter situations where enforcing the law would cause more harm than looking the other way?" Gilroy's answer was careful. Policing isn't about laws. It's about order. And sometimes order requires understanding that the law is just one tool among many. The challenge is knowing when to use it and when to use something else. "What's the something else?" the student pressed. "Wisdom," Gilroy said, "and humility about how little power you actually have." Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, exactly 4 years after Judge Stevens' heart attack. Johnson collapsed while having breakfast at Wells' Supper Club, his regular spot, his regular table. He was 62 years old. The cause of death, heart attack. Over 1,200 people attended his funeral at Abyssinian Baptist Church. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. delivered the eulogy, calling Johnson a complicated man who loved his community in complicated ways. Police Commissioner Howard Leary sent flowers. FBI Special Agent Arthur Nolan attended, but stood outside, watching from across the street. The New York Times obituary was 4 paragraphs. It described Johnson as alleged organized crime figure and noted his controversial role in Harlem community affairs. It made no mention of his negotiations with law enforcement, no mention of the peace he'd maintained, no mention of the riots that never happened. The Amsterdam News ran a front-page story under the headline, "Harlem's Unofficial Mayor Dies." The article detailed his charitable work, his political connections, and his complex legacy. It quoted dozens of community members who described him as protector, benefactor, and the only person who seemed to care whether they lived or died. Both narratives were true. Neither was complete. Red Mitchell, Johnson's political fixer, destroyed most of his documentation before his own death in 1989. But among his papers, researchers found a single handwritten note dated March 18th, 1964, the morning after the raid. "Last night proves something I've always suspected. Real power isn't about force. It's about making people understand that cooperation serves their interests better than confrontation." The commissioner thought he was threatening Bumpy. Instead, he was negotiating his own obsolescence. The FBI thought they were investigating crime. Instead, they were discovering that crime is just another word for alternative governance. And everyone walked away believing they'd won something. That's the art of it. Everyone believes they won. The March 17th, 1964 raid remains officially undocumented. No police reports exist. No arrest records. No witness statements. The NYPD's internal file for that date contains a single notation: routine patrol activity. No incidents reported. But the consequences rippled through decades. Frank Serpico's crusade against corruption began with questions raised that night. Commissioner Murphy's early retirement changed NYPD leadership at a critical moment. The FBI's Red Hook heroin bust became a template for organized crime investigations. Harlem's relative peace through the mid-1960s influenced national policy debates about urban policing. The deaths of Brennan and Ramirez remain listed as closed cases with undetermined circumstances. And perhaps most significantly, the precedent established that night that law enforcement could negotiate with criminal organizations to maintain social order, quietly influenced policing strategies in urban black neighborhoods for the next 2 decades. It's a precedent nobody wants to acknowledge, because acknowledging it requires answering an impossible question. If the choice is between enforcing the law and preventing riots, between arresting community leaders and maintaining peace, between official justice and practical stability, what should police actually do? Commissioner Murphy chose stability. History has been arguing about whether he was right ever since. In 2014, 50 years after the raid that never happened, a group of historians from Columbia University attempted to investigate the incident. They filed FOIA requests for NYPD records, FBI surveillance logs, and personal papers of key figures. The NYPD claimed no responsive records existed. The FBI released heavily redacted documents that confirmed surveillance of Johnson's residence, but contained a suspicious 12-hour gap on March 17, 1964, the longest single gap in 18 months of continuous observation. Personal papers of Commissioner Murphy, donated to the New York Historical Society after his death in 2003, contained one interesting artifact: a handwritten note dated March 18, 1964, that read simply, "Some problems can't be arrested. They must be managed." The note was clipped to a photograph of Harlem at sunrise. Today, for 09, Edgecombe Avenue still stands. It's a residential building, same as it was in 1964. There's no historical marker, no plaque commemorating what happened, or didn't happen, on that March night. The residents who live there now have no idea that their building was once the site of negotiations that prevented riots, altered police policy, and proved that power in New York has always been more fluid than official hierarchies suggest. And maybe that's appropriate, because the real legacy of March 17, 1964, isn't what happened in Bumpy Johnson's apartment. It's what didn't happen on Harlem streets. No riots, no deaths, no federal occupation, no burned buildings, no traumatized children growing up in war zones. The absence of violence isn't dramatic. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't get commemorated. But for the 230,000 people living in Harlem during the summer of 1964, that absence meant everything. They just never knew who to thank for it, or whether they should, because the peace was real, but so was the compromise that created it. And 60 years later, we're still debating whether that compromise was wisdom or corruption, pragmatism or betrayal, leadership or cowardice. The answer, like most truth in Harlem during the 1960s, probably depends on who you ask, and whether you were there when the doors burst open and the chess game paused and 12 police officers learned that arresting someone and defeating them are two very different things. Frank Serpico, now in his 80s and living in Europe, was asked in a 2019 interview about the most important lesson he learned as a young officer. His answer was immediate: that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who break the law. They're the ones who understand it well enough to make it irrelevant. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Some stories teach themselves, and some silences echo longer than any confession ever could.